Topic of today's discussion is a brief history of Indian writing in English. The two significant events that contributed towards the birth, towards the genesis and growth of Indian writing in English is one is the decision to introduce English as a language of medium of instruction in India, and the other one is English literature has been started being taught in Indian universities. These are the two significant events that paved the way for the birth of English literature being written in India. Another thing is, in the year 1780, the first newspaper in English has been published by Augustus Hickey. The title of the newspaper was Bengal Gazette, and in 1817, the first college has been established, Hindu College, which later became Presidency College, one of the premier educational institutions of Bengal, was founded. And the famous Minute of Macaulay that was introduced in 1833 and which provided some kind of a strong foundation for establishing the discipline English literature and also the language, which English language, which began to be introduced in our offices, public places, in our schools and colleges as a medium of instruction. And the famous comment, the controversial comment made by Macaulay, that was also something very significant, and it shows us the prejudice of the British people towards the colonies and the culture, language, everything regarding the colonies. A single shelf of a good layer of a library is worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. All the historical information which has been collected in the Sanskrit language is less than what may be found in the paltry abridgments used at preparatory schools of England. So this was speaking a very asymmetrical system that has been prevailing there in that world. Later, that paved the way for the for this post-colonial literary theories. And post-coloniality has been making an interrogation of the asymmetries, all the types of asymmetries that has been prevailing in that world. And as a result, what happened was English as a language that has been introduced in our education institutions, courts and offices, dislodging the languages like Arabic and Sanskrit. Thus far, English language was really not Arabic and Sanskrit languages were really used instead of English, and English has been to a great extent replacing Arabic and Sanskrit languages used for communication. And Lord Benedict announced in 1835 that the policy of the government, the colonial government, that was a favor English language alone policy that has been announced by Lord William Benedict in the year 1835. The three universities, University of Bombay, University of Madras and University of Calcutta, established in the year in 1857. That was really something very noteworthy regarding the establishment of English language, regarding the establishment of English literature here. The first book ever written by an Indian in English was The Travels of Dean Muhammad, written by Sheikh Dean Muhammad in the year 1794. And the first novel ever written in English language was by Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. The novel was titled as Raj Mohan's Wife, appeared in 1864. Bankim Chandra Chatterjee was a very renowned Bengali author, but he wrote the first English novel also. The period from 1850 to 1900 is the imitative phase, when the Indian poets were romantic poets in their Indian garb. The poets who wrote poems in English language, they were simply imitating the English romantic poets, or it was really the phase of early romantic period in the Indian history, or in the history of Indian English poetry. The chief sources of inspiration were the famous romantic poets Wordsworth, Shelley, Keats, Byron, Scott. Uh, the period from 1900 to 1947 was the assimilative period because they were imitating the romantic poetry of English literature, but at the same time they were really trying to assimilate many of the nationalistic elements into the literature, into the writings. They tried to assimilate the romanticism of early 19th century British poets and new romantics of the decadent period. And at the same time, they were really trying to use poetry for expressing some kind of a national consciousness that also paved the political consciousness, political changes, nationalism, etc. That also paved the way for India's winning of freedom in 1947. We know that some kind of an awakening of consciousness that was really happening in the first half of 19th century, 20th century in India under the leadership of Gandhi in the political sphere, and we had a series of leaders here who were really giving leadership to our political struggle, to our struggle for independence. But at the same time, at the level of literature, we can see that some kind of a nationalistic consciousness that they were really trying to express in literature. In the first phase of Indian poetry, we can take this as the period of literary renaissance in India. And the first phase of Indian poetry was also called as the period of literary renaissance in India. Henry Thoreau's poems can be taken as included in this category. And Kasi Prasad Ghosh, the share of minstrel, Michael Madhusudan Dutt's The Captive Lady, Manmohan Ghosh, Love Songs and Elegies. These are really some of the important collections of poetry published in the first phase of Indian poetry. And when we move on to the second phase, we can see the celebrated Sarojini Naidu, Rabindranath Tagore, Aravind Ghosh, and Harindranath Chattopadhyay. They were some of the important poets who were there in the second phase of Indian English poetry. And the poetic output of these poets were really completely prolific. And romanticism of these Indian poets was fraught with nationalism, spirituality, and mysticism. There were really equal amount of elements like nationalism, spirituality, and mysticism were really equally mixed up in the poetry of these celebrated iconic poets like Naidu, Sarojini Naidu, Tagore, and Aravind Ghosh. And when we move on to the novel, the birth of English novel in India, we can see that one important figure related with the birth of English novel in India, Indian English novel, is R.C. Dutt. He was considered as an important figure. He wrote 6 novels in Bengali, out of which 2 he translated into English: The Lake of Palms and The Slave Girl of Agra. These are some earlier novelists who wrote novels in English in India, and they were really first not writing in English but in the regional languages, but later these novels were really translated into English. T. Ramakrishna wrote Die for Death, Sarna Ghoshal wrote Fatal Garland, Krabbabai Satyanathan, one woman writer in Indian English fiction, wrote Kamala, a story of a Hindu life, Balkrishna, The Love of Kusuma, Sir Joginder Singh Nasrin, Rajamayar, Vasudeva Shastri, A. Madhavan in Tillai Govindan. So these were some of the earlier fiction writers. They wrote in the regional languages. Many of these works were really later translated into English. The iconic figure in Indian English fiction, as in poetry, is Rabindranath Tagore. Tagore was a writer of, he was a Bengali writer, but at the same time he wrote in English also. He wrote with equal felicity and grace in both Bengali and English languages. He was an accomplished poet, playwright, and painter. Above all, Tagore was a spiritual guru. He was the spiritual leader of India's struggle for independence, and he conceived educational institutions like Vishwabharati. And Vishwabharati University was actually established by Tagore, and he was introducing his model of education to the whole world through this establishment of an educational institution like Vishwabharati. Later it became a university. And the two important novels written by Tagore are Home and the World and Gora. And The Wreck is also a very important novel. So, Home and the World, The Wreck, and Gora are important novels written by Tagore. And Gora, Home and the World is really Garebai, right? It's the Bengali title of the novel. And Home and the World is really something that propels or Tagore introduces in that novel his idea of nationalism and universalism or internationalism. Gitanjali, the poetic collection written by Tagore, that was fetching him the highest honor, the Nobel Prize in Literature in the year 1930. Gitanjali is really a collection of songs. It can be translated as a supplication of songs. That was written by Tagore, and that was bringing him the prestigious Nobel Prize in Literature, the first Asian winning that prize. Tagore was the first Asian winning the Nobel Prize for Literature. And Mulkraj Anand, R.K. Narayan, and Raja Rao are considered as the triumvirates of Indian English fiction writing, and the trinity of Indian writing in English. They were the earlier fiction writers. So they wrote in English, novels in English, and they established novel as a literary form in India. And one thing is quite significant. They were trying to give a representation to Indian life in English. And novel, we know that it's a Western literary form, but they were just absorbing it, assimilating to the Indian realities for giving some kind of an expression of Indian life and Indian sensibilities in this literary form. And English is a language of our intellectual makeup. It is not that of our emotional makeup, and they believed in that. And this kind of an assimilation they were really doing in the literary form called novel. And they were really, yeah, these three writers, Anand, Narayan, and Rao, they were establishing the literary form novel here in India. Mulkran Anand, he wrote social realism or social realistic novels, especially his Untouchable, Coolie, Two Leaves and a Bud. And these are really some of the novels of Mulkraj, and R.K. Narayan is also he was a very prolific writer, and he introduced this fictitious town Malgudi in his work. And Raja Rao was also a very renowned, celebrated writer of Indian English, earlier face of Indian English fiction. When we move on to Mulkuraj Anand, we can see that he started his career with the novel Untouchable, and yeah, the hero Baka was really a low-caste sweeper boy, and the novel is a description of the experience that he undergoes in one day. And the novel was really structured on Ulysses, yeah, James Joyce Ulysses, and he has been trying to imbibe the stream of consciousness technique introduced by James Joyce. And the village, across the black waters, and the sword and the sickle are some other novels written by Mulkraj Anand. R.K. Narayan, as I mentioned, the first novel was For Me and Friends. He created the fictitious region of a town called Malgudi in English, in Indian English literature, through his novels. And The Dark Room, the second novel, The Guide, the third novel, all the novels were really widely accepted by readers. Raja Rao, the author of Kantapura, Serpent and the Rock, Cat and Shakespeare, Comrade Kilraw, Kirillov, and The Cow of the Barricades are some of the works written by Raja Rao. When we move on to the next phase, we can see the next significant writer was Salman Rushdie. His Midnight Children, published in the year 1981, that was really backed Booker Prize in the year Booker of Bookers in 1992 and the Best of Bookers in 2008. 3 times this novel has been awarded Booker Prize for Literature, and he ushered in a new trend of writing. He used a hybrid language in his fiction writing, generously, some kind of a mixing up of language, cultures, and the whole style of writing that was that can be it can be easily categorized uh, in magical realism, the celebrated writer of celebrated mode of fiction writing introduced by the Latin American writers like Gabriel Garcia Marquez. So, Midnight Children was a celebrated novel in Indian English literature, and we were really, it was a coming of age for Indian English fiction. And this novel was really a blend of history, politics, etc. So Rushdie has been showing us how we can mix novel writing with a lot of history and politics being put in it. And the Salim Sinai, the central character of the novel, he was born in the midnight of 1947, midnight of 14th August 1947, and Salim Sinai was really born exactly in the time of the birth of his country, independent India was also born simultaneously at the same time, at the same time of the birth of independent India was really born at the birth of exactly at the moment of the birth of the central character of the novel. So he says that his story is really handcuffed with the story of his country, and magical realism, history, politics, a mixing of languages, everything is there. In the novel was a wonderful experimentation, and it has become a huge success. Uh, and that was a turning point in the history of Indian English novel. And some other fiction writers like Nayanthara Sakal, Anita Desai, Ruskin Pond, Vikram Seth, Amitav Ghosh, Rohinton Mistry, Shashi Tharoor, Vikram Chandra, Suketu Mehta, Arvind Attika, all these fiction writers were really later got a very good critical acclaim. Thank you.